Hey, pushers. Okie dokie. Here we go. The American Revolution. So, quick recap here. England, with the help of the colonists, fight the French Indian War in 1754. English win. It's actually a global war. It can really be classified as the First World War because it takes place in all the major continents in North America, in Europe. There's some fighting in Africa, and there's fighting in Asia. So there's battles happening all over the place. But we're just concerned about the American portion here. England wins. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, all of the French claims east of the Mississippi are given to the English. So that England has all of this land up to the Mississippi River, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River. Yay! We're happy. Everything's great. God, we love England. They're protecting us so well. Well, then the English pass a law, and this is really, really, really super, super, super duper important that you know this. It's the Proclamation of 1763. Okay? Proclamation of 1763. And here's what it says. Nobody, no settlers can go west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains run right along the western portion of the English colony. So if you look on a map and you see all of those 13 colonies, the border, the western border for all those colonies are the Appalachian Mountains. And the English say, 1763, Proclamation of 1763, you can't go over those mountains. Okay? You can't go into the Ohio country that we've just won from France. The reason is we don't know what's out there. We do know there's Native Americans out there, and they're not real fond of people just showing up on their land now, and bad things happen, battles, and people die, and things like that. And we really don't have the ability to protect you out there. So don't go over there. Well, a lot of colonists are very upset about this, and they begin to go over the Appalachian Mountains. They figure, we helped you win this territory. We should have a chance to settle this territory. So, despite the proclamation of 1763, colonists begin going over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio country. Guess what happens? Yup. They begin to get attacked. They begin to die. There's bad things happening to them out there. And they go back to England and say, we need your help. We need your protection. And English go, good Lord, we told you not to go over there. Why don't you listen? On top of that, England has a lot of debt from this war. So they have to pay back all of this money that they fought in the war. And then the Americans are asking for their protection because they wouldn't abide by the proclamation of 1763. So England decides, if you want the protection, you got to pay for it. And they begin to tax. Help pay for the French Indian War, the American portion of the French Indian War, as well as try to provide some protection because you went into the Ohio country even when you weren't told to. They begin taxing. And of course, you guys know you did the 10 steps. That doesn't work out real well. Lots of protest, lots of anger, lots of frustration. And the tension builds, tension builds, tension builds, tension builds until we're in a revolution against England. So the colonies choose George Washington, who at one time was a English commander, and he's quite possibly the most experienced military commander in the colonies at that time. He's certainly one of the wealthiest, which didn't hurt his chances of getting chosen. We go to war. The English, the greatest military the world had ever known. They're the largest, they're the strongest, they're the best equipped, they're the best trained. We don't have an army. We have a bunch of farmers with muskets and pitchforks. This is not going to go well. And it doesn't. We lose, we lose, we lose, we lose, we lose. All right, so we're not going to go through the whole revolution. Just know, for the most part, it doesn't go well for the United States. So we're just going to do some of the highlights from the greatest underdog story in the history of mankind. Now that might be an overstatement, but we'll go with it. It's a good title. All right, so the Battle of Trenton this happens in December of 1776. The past summer, we declared independence from England. The revolution really gets going 1774, 1775. And eventually, with the Declaration of Independence, it becomes very clear what this war is about. Initially, the war is not about independence. The war is about the colonists getting the respect and getting treated the way they felt they should because they were English citizens. They just wanted to be treated equally as British citizens. That initially is what the battle is about, and it doesn't change until we get to the Declaration of Independence, and this war is now about becoming separate. Great story here. Oh my goodness, this is a great story. So, I should tell you guys, these are going to be different kind of notes. I'm not going to have a lot of text that pops up to kind of guide you and tell you what to write. So you're going to have to kind of listen and pay attention to these notes. Just a different type of lecture. So the Battle of Trenton, December 1776. George Washington has lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. Battle after battle after battle. The troops are demoralized. A lot of them are coming to the end of their contract. These American colonial farmers and merchants who enlisted into the colonial army and into the Continental Army. They signed a contract. Well, many of their contracts are coming due, and there's a fear, because this war is going so badly, that many of these are just going to leave and go back home. On top of that, the colonies don't have any money, and so many of them have gone unpaid, and it's just a bad time. George Washington's trying to get the Continental Congress to pony up more money to help fund and pay the troops. Help fund, supply the troops and pay them their wages. And the Continental Congress is fairly reluctant because, one, they don't have any money, and two, they're afraid that they're going to be investing in a losing cause here. So George Washington needs a victory. He needs something to happen. Brings us to December 24th, 1776, Christmas Eve. George Washington is going to make his famous midnight crossing of the Delaware River, which is depicted here. And we'll talk about it here in a minute, about this painting here. This is a very interesting painting. He makes his famous crossing of the Delaware River into New Jersey at midnight on Christmas Eve. Here's why he's going. The English, for the most part, the bulk of the English troops, and certainly the best of the English troops, are not in the colonies. Most of the troops and the better troops are all back in England because, France. So the English have hired soldiers. These soldiers are from Germany. They're called Hessians. That's what a Hessian soldier looks like. They're German soldiers. And Hessians it's a state in Germany. Germany doesn't exist yet. Germany won't exist as a country until 1860s. So Germany has all these random states. And Germans know one thing. They can do one thing really, really well. They like to fight, and they're really good at it. And the Hessians are, in particular, really good. So the Hessians hire themselves out. Hessian soldiers would hire themselves out to go fight other people's wars. They're mercenaries, soldiers of fortune. So the English have hired a bunch of Hessian soldiers. You guys all know something about Hessian soldiers. You just don't know that you know something about Hessian soldiers. It is a Hessian soldier in the famous story, The Headless Horseman. The Headless Horseman is about a Hessian soldier who had his head chopped off during the American Revolution. That's The Headless Horseman. So George Washington, from his experience as an English soldier, knows about the Hessians. They are particularly brutal. They are particularly violent. He also knows Germans like to party a lot. And they especially love to party on Christmas. So, George Washington knows on Christmas Eve, the Germans are going to have a big celebration. George Washington also knows that it's European tradition that you don't fight during the winter. In Europe, fighting in the winter was considered to be uncivilized. In the winter, you would settle down, you would bed down, and you would wait out the winter. And then when spring came, you would just pick up the war wherever it was that you left off, because it's no fun fighting in the snow and the cold, and that's just unpleasant. And so it was ungentlemanly, it was uncivilized to fight during the winter. So the Hessians would believe that everything was going to be fine until at least the spring, and it was Christmas Eve, so let's have a party. So George Washington knew that the Hessians were going to be drunk out of their minds. So on midnight, Christmas Eve, 1776, George Washington and the Continental Army make their crossing across the Delaware River at midnight in total darkness. The river was choked with ice chunks. They did have to push ice chunks out of the way of the boats. And at dawn, George Washington and the Continental Army attacked the drunken Hessian soldiers and slaughtered them. It was a major, major victory for the Americans because they were fighting, drunken soldiers. And George Washington now has his first real victory. George Washington now has something that he can go back to Congress and try to get them to free up more money and hopefully keep many of the Continental soldiers whose contracts were coming to an end to reenlist and to stay on. It gives hope to this fledgling colonial cause. So that's the Battle of Trenton. Again, the Americans win by attacking a bunch of drunken German soldiers on Christmas Day. Now, let's talk about this picture. This is a very famous picture. We have George Washington standing up in the boat, right, in the American flag, and all these people are rowing across valiantly, rowing across the river, pushing ice chunks out of the boats, right? And here's the flotilla back here behind him, the rest of his troops. So many things wrong. So this painting is not going to be done until about 100 years after the Battle of Trenton. And we can look at this painting, although it's a very famous painting, and it's a very patriotic painting of the gallant George Washington leading his troops off to battle. So many things wrong. They attacked at midnight. There would be no daylight. If you've ever been in a rowboat, and they did go across in rowboats, that's essentially what they were. They were rowboats. If you've ever been in a rowboat, you don't stand up in a rowboat. Really bad things happen when you stand up in a rowboat. They did have to push ice chunks away from the ship, from the boats. This is true, as being depicted here. What they didn't do is hang their feet over the sides of the boat. That's a really bad idea. Bad things happen. There was no American flag at this time. The Stars and Stripes had not been invented. They did bring horses over on ships, on boats. That did happen, which was very perilous. What they didn't do was ride on the back of horses as they're going across in a boat. We also see in this photograph, in this painting here, an African American in a boat with George Washington. Now, George Washington did have one of his slaves who was probably his best friend. Honestly, was probably his best friend. And this slave was with George Washington through the entire war and was with George Washington until he died. And they had a very close relationship with one another. But there was no African American on the boat at all. So why is he depicted? The artist was an abolitionist at the time, and this was more of a political statement than it was a historical statement. It was a political statement to show African Americans have always been involved in the most important events in American history. To a large degree, that's true, but not here. Hmm. So, we get to the Battle of Saratoga, September 19th, October 7th, 1777. Here's what's happening. The United States desperately needs help. And the United States, well, we're not the United States yet, America, the colonies desperately needed help in the war. They were afraid of losing the war. So they're looking for somebody to help them. Well, what would be the logical country to go ask for help if you're fighting the British? If you said France, you would be correct. So Ben Franklin is over in France asking, begging, pleading with the French government to help them fight the British. It is appealing to the French to go kill a couple of British, right? They would be more than happy to be involved in that. Are the French enamored by the prospects of American independence and a new democracy springing up and overthrowing a sitting monarch? That's not very appealing to the French. The French government has no interest in our political ambitions. They're very interested in having a shot at the British. However, the French are very worried about the prospects of the Americans winning this war. The French do not want to get involved in this war on the side of the Americans if the Americans are going to lose, because that would just cause more problems for the French in Europe, and they don't need that. So the French government tells the Americans, if you can stand up to the English and fight them toe to toe in an actual battle, like you're not attacking drunk soldiers who are passed out at dawn, right? You can't do that. You meet them on a battlefield and you stand toe to toe with them in a conventional battle and you win. If you can show that you can beat the British in a fair fight, in a direct fight, we will help you. That brings us to the Battle of Saratoga. George Washington leads the Continental Army in a battle in the fields of New York, Saratoga, New York, against the English. And we stand toe to toe with them and we fight them in a traditional battle. And the Continental Army wins. Yay! And now this gives the green light to the French to begin aiding the United States economically and, more importantly, militarily. So that's the significance of the Battle of Saratoga. It is what convinces France to become involved in this war. And it's one of the few battles where the United States meet the English on a battlefield in a traditional battle and beat them. For the most part, we lost, and we lost, and we lost, and we lost. Brings us to the Valley Forge, December 1777 through June of 1778. Valley Forge is in Pennsylvania, and this was a particularly brutal, cold, snowy winter. It was an awful time. It was a horrible time. It was a time of a lot of self-doubt for the Americans, the Continental Army, and the prospects of a new nation. The Continental Army had lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. We had lost a lot of men. Excuse me. We had lost a lot of men. We had lost a lot of money. And we had lost a lot of ground. George Washington chose Valley Forge in Pennsylvania to settle down for the winter because remember, in European wars, you don't fight during the winter. That's just uncivilized. Who does that? That's terrible, right? Wars are all about being civil. Wars are all about being gentlemanly. It's very weird. It's a European thing. So they settle down in Valley Forge, and this is a very low time. There's a lot of desertions from the American Continental Army. They hadn't been fed. There was no food. They hadn't been supplied any of their rations that the Continental Congress had promised them, and it being wintertime, there was no food around for them to find. And so the colonists, the Continental Army, they literally are boiling and eating their boot leather. If they had boots, many of them, as you can see depicted here, right there, many of them don't have boots. They're barefoot in the snow. That is an accurate depiction. To make matters worse, the quarters in which the troops were stationed in were pretty dismal. These are a picture of the huts that the troops were stationed in Valley Forge. Very small, very drafty, no heat, a miserable, miserable experience. George Washington, on the other hand, and other officers had much better quarters. This is George Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge. That's a much better looking place than what the soldiers have. So George Washington is very worried about desertions. He's very worried about the morale of his troops, and he's very worried about the status of the war. So George Washington wants to turn this group of ragtag merchants and farmers into a true fighting force, on par with European fighting forces. He also believes that in the training to become a true army, a true disciplined, trained army, going through that training would take their minds off of their conditions, would maybe increase the morale, give them something to do, and feel like they're working towards their ultimate goal. So George Washington is going to bring in somebody to help train the troops. He's a former Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben. Baron von Steuben is a Prussian military officer. Prussia is another state in Germany, in what will become Germany. It's like the Hessians, right? We're from Hesse, which is a state in Germany. He's from Prussia, P, not Russia, Prussia with a P in Germany. And he was a military commander in Prussia. He had been kicked out of the Prussian military and exiled from Prussia. I'll tell you why in a minute. And so George Washington knows Baron von Steuben from his time as an English officer in the English Navy or Army. He has a lot of respect for Baron von Steuben and knows Baron von Steuben is a taskmaster, that Baron von Steuben trained his troops, and his troops were some of the best trained and most disciplined troops in Europe. So George Washington asked Baron von Steuben, who's been exiled from his country, to come to America to train the Continental Army. And Baron von Steuben does. He arrives in Valley Forge and begins training the troops, teaching them how to march, teaching them how to fire in a line in the Continental style, which is a very bizarre form of fighting where they stand in a straight line and they all fire at the same time, and then they let the other side fire at them. And European rules of warfare are just weird. But Baron von Steuben teaches this American army to be a disciplined army, to stand in the face of fire, how to march into battle, how to fight like a force, so that when they come out of Valley Forge that spring, they are a disciplined, trained fighting force, ready to engage the English. All right, so let's talk about Baron von Steuben. Why is he kicked out of the Prussian military and exiled from Prussia? Well, it's found out, although it had long been whispered, it is finally found out for a fact that Baron von Steuben was gay. And that was a fact that could not sit well, did not sit well with 17th, 18th century European society, unfortunately. And because of that, Baron von Steuben was driven out of the military, was driven out of Prussia, and became a man without a country. George Washington didn't care. George Washington either didn't care or was not that concerned about it, because he does ask Baron von Steuben to come over and welcomes Baron von Steuben, and Baron von Steuben becomes an honorary American soldier. After the war, Baron von Steuben does stay in the United States and has a long relationship with two former soldiers that he trained at Valley Forge. There you go. 1778, following the Battle of Saratoga, we finally get a formal commitment from the French agreeing to come support the United States. Again, they don't support our political causes. That scares them, this thought of overthrowing a monarch, but they support us because it gives them a chance to take it to the British. Any chance they can kick the British, anytime they can kill the British, they're down for it. And so the Treaty of Alliance 1778, France agrees to ally itself with the Americans, with the colonies, in their fight for independence against the British. Yay! Brings us to the Battle of Yorktown, October 19th, 1781. This is the big climatic battle. Yorktown is in Virginia. And the British, it is a British stronghold. And George Washington is going to attack with his newly trained troops, with his troops trained by Baron von Steuben, with the help of Marquis de Lafayette. They're going to attack this British stronghold in the Battle of Yorktown. They attack them from the ground, attacking them from all sides. The British are holding their ground. They're waiting for the English Navy, who is stationed in New York City, which was held by the British at that time. The British had sent word to the English Navy in New York City that they desperately needed their help, and to get to Yorktown to help them and defeat the Americans once and for all. They knew this was the last gasp of the Americans. So the English Navy is on its way down from New York City to Yorktown. George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette have driven the American forces onto the battlefield and are engaging the British back and forth. Right? It's just crazy. Just craziness taking place. There's bombs and cannonballs and all kinds of craziness taking place. The British are desperately holding on, waiting for the great English Navy to appear, coming up from the ocean to save them and to rescue them and to once and for all defeat the British. And then off in the distance, they can see the masts of ships in the ocean making their way towards Yorktown. And the British are thrilled. This is it. This is our moment in the sun. We're going to defeat the Americans once and for all and put this bloody war to end forever and ever. However, as the English watched the masts of the ships grow larger and the ships themselves begin to appear, their hopes are dashed. It is not English naval battleships that are coming into Yorktown. It is French battleships who have beaten the English ships to Yorktown. Surrounded on all sides, the English surrender to George Washington. And the war, for all intents and purposes, is over. Now, this was a war unlike any war England had ever engaged in before. England had fought colonial wars, but all of their wars had always been fought against other people. For the first time, they were fighting their own people. That never sat well with a lot of people in England. And even though England won battle after battle after battle after battle, they could never have that one final decisive death blow to the Americans. The Americans always seemed to escape and always were able to survive until the next time. So the British could never just put that one final nail in the coffin. And the war drug on, and the war drug on, and the war drug on. And meanwhile, the war back in England becomes more and more unpopular, politically unpopular. People couldn't understand why the greatest military, the best equipped military the world had ever known to that point, couldn't win, could not defeat a bunch of angry farmers who had nothing more than muskets and pitchforks. How can you not beat them? They have nothing. They're not an army. They're just a bunch of peasants. And we can't beat them. The war becomes more and more and more expensive and becomes a drain on the royal treasury, which is beginning to have all sorts of economic problems back in England. So this war just drags out and becomes very unpopular in England. And the British just can never get that final death knell. And so England surrenders. We don't beat England. We don't win against England. England just quit. And that's it. So it brings us to the Treaty of Paris, September 3rd, 1783. So if you ever are in a trivia game and someone asks, where was such and such a peace treaty signed, always say Paris. Chances are you'll have a good shot at getting it right. Why are peace treaties signed in Paris? I don't know. Seems like a good place, I guess. So the Americans show up at the Treaty of Paris to negotiate this agreement with the British. Here's the American delegation. This is Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Pinckney, George Rutledge, all these guys who were big names back at that time, show up to get a treaty with England. And here's what we get. The terms of the treaty. The United States asks for and receives all of the land to the Mississippi. England says, sure, take it. The United States asks for and receives a recognition of American independence. English say, fine. Here's what the English ask for. Nothing. They just wanted to be done. And that's the end of the war. We are now an independent nation. Yay! But we've got all kinds of problems we got to deal with. If you notice in this picture, this is the picture appears to be undone. And it is. There was an American artist who painted many of the famous paintings of this time comes from this American artist. Name is Turnbull. That's his last name. And he traveled with the American delegation to Paris for this peace treaty. And after they had agreed to the peace treaty, both sides agreed that they would sit down for a formal portrait. Right? So everybody can go back and put on their Sunday best and freshen up and come sit down for the official portrait commemorating the ending of this war. So there's an agreed upon time. The American delegation shows up. The English delegation never showed up. They just went home. And so this portrait is never completed. And that's why it looks like it. And now here's what the map looks like following the Treaty of Paris. All of the green now belongs to the newly minted, the newly named United States of America. All of the orange, I guess, belongs to the Spanish. All of the pink is British. And then there's some Russians hanging out up here. But we are now our own nation. We are independent. And now it's up to us to figure out what to do. And when we start out, we do an awful job of figuring out what to do. And that's next time. All right, Panthers, make sure you take a picture of your notes, send them to me. Make sure, so I know that you did them. And we'll see you later. If you have any questions, you have any problems, you have any concerns, make sure you get in touch with me and I'll help you as much as I can. All right. Take care, Panthers.